Hello, Bob, and thank you once again for joining us. Let's start with the economic calendar, shall we? Promises to be a busy week ahead, with the markets expecting further monetary policy assistance from central banks. What other key stats will move the dial, and what can we expect from the major currencies?
Relatively busy week for the US dollar. First half of the week, we got New York Empire State manufacturing numbers for November. Unlikely to move the dial, however, barring particularly dire numbers. Focus will be on retail sales figures for October. These are due out on Tuesday, along with industrial production and business inventory numbers. Expect retail sales to have the greatest influence, with the markets looking to assess the damage in the fourth quarter as the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic hits the West. In the second half of the week, focus will shift to Philly Fed manufacturing numbers for November and the all-important weekly jobless claims figures that will garner plenty of interest. For the Eurozone, quiet week ahead. Finalised inflation figures for Italy and the Eurozone unlikely to move the dial. Consumer confidence figures for the Eurozone will draw some interest, however, as the ECB continues to look for consumer spending to drive the economic rebound. But with lockdown measures across a number of Eurozone member states, obviously these numbers could weigh heavily on the euro, particularly ahead of an anticipated move by the ECB next month. For the pound, busy week ahead. Inflation figures at the start of the week, that will draw plenty of interest. Then focus shifts to retail sales figures in the second half of the week. With the BOE ready to drop rates into negative territory, expect these numbers to have a material influence on the pound.
The COVID-19 pandemic continues to threaten the global economy around the world, but with positive news and talk regarding a new vaccine, this could ease market jitters. But regarding commodity currencies, what key stats should we be looking out for in the week ahead?
For the commodity currencies, relatively quiet week ahead. For the loonie, early part of the week, we got manufacturing and wholesale sales figures due out unlikely to move the dial. In the second half of the week, however, inflation and retail sales figures will garner plenty of interest as central banks begin to do another round of monetary policy easing because of the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously dire numbers could begin to raise questions over what lies ahead for the BOC and on monetary policy. For the Aussie dollar, quiet week, but of influence. Third quarter wage growth figures unlikely to be of particular influence, but unemployment figures on Thursday will draw plenty of interest. Following last week's RBA monetary policy move, obviously these dire numbers, if they are dire, would obviously raise questions of whether more support is going to be needed. The RBA has assured that more would be on the horizon if required. In the early part of the week, on the monetary policy front, the RBA minutes will also draw interest on Tuesday. For the Kiwi dollar, quiet week. Inflation figures for the third quarter due out. They will influence, particularly following the RBNZ policy decision last week. So expect plenty of influence from these numbers in the week.
While there is plenty to consider for the week ahead, what key stats should our traders be looking out for in regards to Japan and China?
For the Japanese yen, busy week on the economic calendar. Third quarter GDP numbers in focus on Monday. That will draw plenty of interest ahead of trade figures on Wednesday. And then we've got inflation figures at the end of the week. Expect the GDP numbers to be of particular interest, as will trade data, particularly with the West struggling with the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. Will the numbers finally force the BOJ into action? They've made plenty of promises, so this week's numbers could prove pivotal in what lies ahead on the monetary policy front, particularly when you're looking at a strengthening in the yen off the back of dollar weakness. For the Chinese yuan and economic data out of China, it's a busier week. We got the all-important industrial production, retail sales and unemployment figures. These will garner plenty of interest, as will fixed asset investments. The markets are looking for a continued recovery in the Chinese economy that many of the central banks have called resilient following the COVID-19 pandemic.
And lastly, away from the calendars, let's focus on geopolitical risk. With the presidential election still being contested by President Trump, Brexit talks still continuing with the EU summit coming up, and of course COVID second wave spreading around the globe. What can we expect from there in the week ahead?
Away from the economic calendar, there are a number of factors to look out for. On the Brexit front, it's last chance saloon with the EU summit on Thursday. So failure to wrap up an agreement before that EU summit and expect both sides to walk away, and that's going to end up being a no-deal Brexit. So there's plenty of focus on that. And obviously you've got Biden in the mix, obviously the internal market bill and the Good Friday Agreement. So there's plenty going on there that could have knock-on effects with Britain's relationship with the US and even a US-UK trade agreement. So that's particularly key in that part of the world. Obviously COVID-19, that remains a factor. We got good news last week on progress towards a vaccine. We're going to need to see continued progress and positive numbers and some clarity in terms of whether the FDA will approve Pfizer's vaccine and how easily it will be to distribute, to inoculate the world. And that's really the only way that we're going to have borders reopening and economies reopening as well. And finally, last but not least, obviously you got the outcome of the US presidential. Trump is, on a mission to reverse that outcome. Markets are not expecting any change in, Biden's victory, but you never know. Obviously recounts going on and lawsuits are being filed left, right and center. So those are the things to keep an eye out for in the week.
Lovely. That's all we have time for today, Bob. Thank you so much for joining us once again, and I'll see you again next week. That was The Week Ahead with Bob Mason of FX Empire. In the meantime, stay up to date with all the latest developments by following us on all our social media outlets.